Another day, another train ride, but this time the hurtling speed of the train felt disconcerting, hurrying almost, rather than the lull, the meditative rocking. I kept being unnecessarily startled whenever someone would come through the cabin doors. We were traveling from Madrid to the south of France and then Torino, Italy. I kept seeing him in the corner of my eye. Something in the casual gazes of the most innocent passerbys reminded me of him, like I was piecing him together anew, patching together a face from these collected glances. I remember him now, shorter than me but taller than Neto. At once handsome but forgettable. His glamour would shift occasionally, I remember that now. Introduced by Gree, he was more middle-aged, like a weathered lieutenant. He even had a mustache like Gree, if I recall. But then after spending some time with us, he took a more youthful appearance, shaved the mustache. He had a thing for clothes as well. But as soon as the new fabric he was wearing, the splash of color, made that impression, he would sink into the wallpaper, always judging, or perhaps only in some kind of careful analysis, always avoiding me as well, if I recall. Anytime I found him and Agatha speaking, I could sense her discomfort, and then his awkwardness was not far off, and he would find an excuse to depart. His powers made him useful as a scout. If he gave himself away, if suspicion arose, he had a way of making them forget they ever came across him. At least that's what I'm remembering now. The details are hazy. He spoke with, now he spoke so infrequently, but was it a thin Russian accent at first? Or was it some kind of American? I think it was American, as he'd come back from overseas to foster this or that alliance with the States. I think Agatha and the rest had enough respect for him, but I see now that he must have kept himself strategically apart, even as I was doing the same for my own insecure reasons. Neto watched the countryside go by, wistfully. Bunny did so on occasion as well, often neglectful of her flames, but we had a permit for a service animal, and people were only bemused by the rabbit's color and kept a respectful distance after glancing in my direction. My scars are a useful social shield sometimes. They're my own blue bunny flames. Neto ate a biscotto he dipped in a latte, which he passed to Bunny after dipping it again, and both of them were unaware of the foam forming on their noses. The thought of losing them both somehow, some way to this manipulator was making me dip between sadness and rage, an emotional cocktail that often led me to drink. I excused myself and walked down the train car. Standing in the shaking of the train settled me a little. I wished for rain, and like a miracle, a bit of rain did come down. Distant thunder. I found the cafe car and perched on a stool and looked out on the timeless Spanish countryside. It looked like it might be raining hard in the distance, but where we were it was only timid gossamer threads. I sank into a melancholic trance. There were a few people down the car having an intimate conversation in a booth. They had piles of candy wrappers and snacks and 4 or 5 empty or half-filled paper cups of espresso, and yet they seemed perfectly calm. Made me think of my sobriety, or rather, of how the more I used to drink, the calmer I became, at least in my mind, the more clear thinking, but also ready to take the most inopportune action at the slightest provocation. I always thought I was fighting for injustice, and then over time it became distorted to the point that I was courting an endgame, I think, a challenge to my own durability. So invulnerable, and yet I was so sensitive to the slightest breeze, the breeziest slight. I had changed. I almost didn't recognize myself sometimes. Conflict was tiresome. Ego made me nauseous. I had discovered and prayed diligently at the altar of tender consideration, of humble deference, and yet I would find myself like this again, sprung back to my transitional state between the monster and the man. It was all his doing. There now. I felt a pulse in my throat like a bitter, rotten, fleshy pit I had to swallow. A passing mural had a picture of a moon, a blue one and a pink one in shadow. I wish more than anything to stop the train and go look at it, appraise its value like I'd once had, ask and find an estimate from its creator, pay them handsomely just because it delighted them and me. Those were good days, a simple hobby. I was probably just trying to find Neto all along. I ordered a palmier from the cafe man, which was surprisingly fresh. Then I went back and ordered a coffee and carefully, meditatively tore it into little dippable chunks and ate it very slowly, the butter touching my tongue and reminding me of rum, somehow also of fresh blood. How long had it been? Well, I suppose there was Simon. The thought made me wince. And the rock that was formerly stuck in my throat started to dissipate, and I, quite embarrassingly, cried onto my gold-ornamented paper plate. Grateful that I was the only one on my side of the cafe car, my tears felt as heavy as lead, as obvious as globs of paint. No doubt, said the voice, no doubt. Lots of doubt. Only doubt, let's be honest. We stopped briefly in Torino, only an hour. We stood in the main square and watched some children play with sparklers as dusk washed over the outline of the buildings like faded memory. Bunny rode on my shoulder and refrained using her flames, but although we got some stares, no one came up to us. Neto must have said a few things to me, but it was in one ear, out the other. Finally, he repeated himself.
Did you hear me, Harry? Do you want to stop in Milan, for a breath, I think? There is good clothes there.
Not on my account. Delay is only making me more nervous, to be frank.
Ah, okay. I wasn't sure. As you like.
Of course, the earliest train from Milan to Como was at 6, so we did have time in Milan with very little open. Neto took Bunny out and about while I excused myself and hung in the train station. Something was petrifying me, not anything I could put my finger on. I simply had an anxious feeling and wanted to place it, and staying still felt better. I ambled around the station, bought some magazines, which I couldn't read very well. My Italian had gotten rusty. I gave a well-dressed beggarman a few coins. I stared at the minute baroquerie of the architecture, had 3 quite good espressos and 1 very dry piece of cheese pizza with burnt basil on top. Neto and Bunny came back in high spirits, so it seemed, just in time for our train. Dawn rose and the outlines of faces assembling to say their goodbyes did the opposite of memory fading, which I suppose is come into greater detail. Like seeing a pointless painting focus while walking backward, we took our seats and Neto went to sleep, as did Bunny in her bag with little, barely imperceptible snores. Our boat driver talked to Neto in an animated fashion, and Neto tried his best to respond in Italian, although I didn't know how either could hear each other over the noise of the motor and the waves. Bunny stayed in her bag. I leaned back, and just then, as an equally speedy outboard started to come in our direction, our captain slowed to a pleasant skip. The sun blinded us from seeing its approach, but just then some clouds drifted and everything became perfectly clear, like a focus of the camera. The woman was standing straight at the head of the skip and retained her balance impeccably as it slowed in its passing. It was not 30 yards off, and I looked at Neto just as he looked at her, and I noticed it was her by his expression, basking in light cherubim to his Madonna, an innocence I'd only seen on Agatha's face once, in the reflection of an empty frame as she laid her hands on my own that day at the piano. Lucy turned a little late, looking, an expression perhaps concerned or like she'd been crying. She saw me and then Neto, and fixed her eyes on Neto a little longer, then turned to me and waved, a salutation almost like a Roman empress, and then the motor resumed its throttle, and she was off in the opposite direction. Well, I leaned back, now suddenly a little more at ease with everything. Like the clouds that had suddenly occluded the blinding sun, I could see a little more clearly for once. Ha! Lucky us! Although I'm sorry for your sake, she's going in the other direction.
I know you are teasing, Harry, but I think it is for the best. I was hoping to see him on my own.
About that, I will be there if you like, but if it's all the same, I've been thinking, and I think it might be best if I'm there for backup.
Yes, that makes sense. That is fine.
We drove on in silence, approaching the shore. And there on the shore, not 20 paces from our dock, we saw a house on the hill. Up a steep path, some marble stairs gleaming in the sun that was now blinding our approach. And we knew that he was there, and I felt he would be alone.